So welcome to this 1 hour webinar. We're going to discuss and analyze the deadlift. So I'm going to work from a PowerPoint, and I'll come in and out of the PowerPoint. So I've got some practical stuff to show you. I always like to be practical, try to give you something to get your teeth stuck into when you go away. But this is really aimed around understanding movement, and in this case, the deadlift. I'm going to be asking questions, so if you can interact with me, that would be amazing. I much prefer teaching in person and face-to-face. Online is fine. Matt, can you silence yourself, please, buddy? He usually sits in the corner of the gym listening into these, so there you go. Thanks, Matt. So first of all, before we begin, I know quite a few of you, or we all are familiar with each other, but if you could just type into the chat box your professional skill sets and why you're here. Why did you choose this particular webinar? What do you want to gain from it, or what was it that piqued your interest? Are you coaching the deadlift? Are you not coaching it for some reason? Do you deadlift yourself, or do you avoid it for any reason? So anything that you're happy to share, if you don't mind putting that in the chat box, and that helps me keep this relevant to you guys. I'm aware some people will be watching this back on a recording. So we are recording this event so that people can then use it as a reference, and those who purchased it to watch back later. If there's any questions that come around or any feedback, then obviously you can contact us through email, info@biomechanics.com, just to set that up. Now, just the wonders of having a fantastic studio and the sun pouring in, it feels great, but I'm hoping you can see me because I've got a little bit of shadow where I'm out of the sunlight, but I could stand here, but I'd look a bit weird. So I'm hoping you can see everything. I have got my ring light on in the background. So just let me know. Can you see me okay? I'm going to go to, thanks Fiona. Yeah, thanks Lyle. I'm going to go to the PowerPoint in a moment anyway. So we've got biomechanics coaches, sports performance coach, teaching deadlifts to doing it for herself as well as teaching it. This is a CPD, getting more CPD, good. We should be getting more CPDs, all of us. I know Sharon is a massive fan. Development in this area for up-to-date knowledge. Hamish, I'm a strength and conditioning coach, and the deadlift is a part of what I need to coach. Brilliant. How long have you been doing that, Hamish? Lyle is a PT and a biomechanics coach. She coaches squats and works with a demographic that tend to find it challenging. Okay. Great. Deadlift and squat. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I think we're all familiar with it. We are going to pick it apart. In some respects, it's a relatively simple movement, but in other aspects, it's very complex. And we're going to kind of touch between the two. Matt, personally, don't get clients to deadlift in the past, yes, but I believe risk to reward, interesting, with current clients is the greater risk until someone has nailed trap bar deadlift. Right, so that's what we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of, Matt. So I hope this is helpful for you, for all of you, obviously. Please understand it is just 1 hour, and the idea of CPD is to expose us to concepts and principles, which is fundamentally where I'm coming from, so that you can go on and do further courses, further research, maybe into some of the things that I bring to light. There are some references. I will give you references to books, individuals who I think would help you develop in this area for some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So I can give you those throughout. So if you've got a notebook and pen, then keep those handy, and then you can make notes as we go. So I'm going to just move you across to the right, share my screen, click on that, share that. And then if I do that, are you okay? Can you see the PowerPoint, guys? Thumbs up? Yep, brilliant. Okay. So my background is about 30 years in the movement industry, how I describe it, Group X, one-to-one, manual therapy, and as a strength and conditioning coach. And my biggest passion is training uninjured. I don't have many clients, as you can imagine, uninjured strength athletes, bodybuilders, powerlifters, strongmen, and women who want to develop the lifts and the techniques through improving their intrinsic biomechanics. That's the kind of area that I enjoy most and I specialize in. And so I'm interested really as to reasons why you picked this particular webinar. So the reasons you gave me earlier were quite simplistic and generic, although Matt's got a bit more into the nuts and bolts. So he's concerned about risk and developing clients with different techniques in advance of actually getting them to deadlift. So that's quite an interesting take, and it certainly fits with the way I'd like to take this discussion today. But if anything comes up as we're talking and as we go through this that you think, actually, Rach, I'd like to know about this particularly, please do type away in the chat box. Whilst I'm in the PowerPoint, I'll get a little red sign comes up and lets me know, so I can come out at the appropriate time, have a read, and hopefully we can get into some of that as well. So this is what we're going to explore over this session. We're going to define the movement, analyze it, understand what can it offer, how we might assess individuals, and understanding the risks involved, which Matt's already highlighted. There is some degree of risks when you're lifting heavy stuff off the floor. But fundamentally, it comes down to that end point, understanding tissue tolerance and load management. And I've got a really great guy that I'm going to point you towards who specialises in research, demonstrating the need of tissue tolerance and load management through his work with athletes. So I'll let you into that when we get to that later. So first of all, defining the movement. In your words, can you type for me into the chat box, what would be a definition of a deadlift in your own words? So from whatever your backgrounds are, there's no right or wrong. Can you share with me, just in a simple term, what's your definition specifically for a deadlift in any language that you would like to use? Matt is saying, I do a deadlift with straight legs, single legs with clients, but not conventional deadlift with a barbell. Okay, so you've mentioned a few terminologies there, conventional, straight leg. So would any of you like to just type into the chat box any other definitions that you might use to explain what is a deadlift? So to define it, hip movement, yep. Simple end, and what movement is that specifically, or movements? Any other joint involvement? We're going to go here later on, so we'll get into more detail with this later, but just to get a general feel for where your heads are around about what a deadlift is. Raising a weight from the floor using the legs. Yeah, again, nice and simple. You guys are on my wavelength. Keep it simple. So there could be two ways of looking at a deadlift, again in simple terms, and its use. Can you give me an example of why you would deadlift? Or for me, there's kind of two angles, maybe two generic angles that you might use in reference to why you might deadlift, or we might encourage a client to deadlift. Introduction to Olympic lifting, yeah, 100%. I'm with you on that one. Picking up a box from the floor. So those would be the two general terms of describing why we would deadlift. Matt says a hip hinge, pushing the floor, sport specific, potentially a big exercise for your back. I think you meant there, and for your butt maybe. Or did you mean bang for your butt? Good. So we're definitely in the same place in terms of analysing a deadlift. Or defining it. Picking up a child, yeah, Fiona will know all about that. Back for your buck, yeah, good. Good. So yeah, we're in the same place. There is the functional aspect, and then there's the sports performance aspect. So one thing that we at Biomechanics Education like to keep a focus on is always how the body works as an integrated system. The three subsystems inside our bodies, the skeleton, the nerves, and the myofascial systems, are integral as an entire unit to how well or badly our clients are able to perform a deadlift. So it's understanding that everything plays in. This is a bite-sized chunk this hour. So we're not going to talk about feet in this particular session. Feet would play in, knees, calves, hamstrings, the nervous system, you know, the neck, the arms, and they're really not areas we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the big joints and the big areas predominantly considered the primary areas for a deadlift. But everything needs to take a place, including shoes, belts, and the type of equipment we lift. So defining the movement, well, we've done that. There's kind of two aspects. There's the functional aspect in terms of picking up children and boxes. And then there's also the sports performance aspect where it crosses into, which is another important area that we're going to look at as well today. So I found this fabulous little video. So if I click that, is it playing for you guys at your end? Yeah. So what you can see with these great little images is, well, these little men, is how deadlifting with a weight too far away creates a longer moment arm, makes it harder to stabilize. The center of gravity is shifted away from the force production, makes it much harder. But when we sit back and we keep the weight close to us, we push up with the legs like Matt was saying, it's a more efficient, safer way with the globe being closer because we've reduced that moment arm. And I don't think any of this is a surprise to you, but it's really important when we start considering the different genetics, the different limitations, the different equipment that we might use, and then the different requirements that we want from prescribing a deadlift into a client's program. So how many different styles of deadlift can you name? Or ways of lifting from the floor? Let's open that up just a little bit. There's different styles. So the deadlift specifically is off the floor, right? Because you're moving a dead weight. But people use that term for other ways of describing similar movements when you're picking things up. Have any of you come across any different terminologies other than deadlift? Because you can go onto the internet, you can research, and there's different models or different ways of performing even a deadlift. If anybody follows powerlifting and creating an efficient, more efficient position to lift the floor, the bar from the floor. So they might take, for example, the feet super wide. That way, there's less load going into the back, if that's what they need, and there's less movement required because they haven't got as far to go till they can lock out to the point where they get a go-ahead lift complete, good lift, you can put it back down. So there's nothing coming in. So we could do a sumo deadlift. Yeah, here we go. Floated deadlift, sumo, straight leg, few examples. That's what I was after. Single leg. There's a Romanian deadlift, which is usually used as a safer option, which is out of the rack, which means there's less need for getting right down to the floor. So you load it into a machine or a rack, you put the weights on, you lift it out, and you start from the hip as opposed to from the floor. Still classed as a Romanian deadlift, but it's not a deadlift in terms of that example of deadlifting it off the floor as a dead weight, which is where the term deadlift comes from. Single leg deadlifts, you could look at where you literally just take one leg off the floor. And you can imagine how we could use all sorts of different equipment. We could use body weight, could use a barbell, kettlebells, dumbbells. So there's a variety of weights. And each of these alterations can either increase risk, decrease risk, or they may make things more specific to the individual's goal or requirement. So having a bit of an understanding of language, but then definition of language. I'm not a massive fan of naming moves. I much prefer a description of the joint actions. So a hip hinge with knee flexion from the floor, you know, straight back, which is how I would describe a deadlift, hands just wider than hip width. Because then we can all picture exactly the same position rather than somebody else is thinking of a Romanian deadlift. So they're starting at the top. So when we go into descriptions, they're in a different mindset. So when analysing movement, we must be really clear about the movement we're defining so that we're all in the same headspace. So for this particular session, I'm going to refer to the deadlift, the typical or conventional deadlift, which is a barbell with plates from the floor with hip flexion and knee flexion and the hands kind of roughly outside the hips, the feet sort of a comfortable position for the client. So not super wide like a sumo, not super narrow, so a kind of mid stance. Toes pointing in any direction they need them to, so no set toe position. And we're going to explore why that is when we start assessing our deadlift client. So if that's okay with everybody, that's the kind of deadlift I'm kind of coming from that I'm talking about here. If you want to ask about single leg or Romanian or any other variant or sumo, we would have to explain and go into that slightly differently just to make sure we're all in the same place when we're describing certain aspects of the deadlift. So just another little look. So looking again, this is lifting the box or the child, as somebody described there. You can see how it incurred some spine flexion, probably not a great idea. Maybe because the extensors weren't strong enough with that length of moment arm to pick that weight off the floor. So they're suggesting in this video, probably don't do it like this. What you can see here with the start position, one of the limitations is going to be mobility of the hip, knees and ankles. If they can't get down in that position, it could be a challenge to get something off the floor. So while that's recommended, it may be something we avoid until we've improved mobility. So we're going to talk later on about that programming to help a client achieve a successful, efficient way to deadlift from the floor, either a small child or a barbell. Now we can talk about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with terminologies like first class levers or first order levers, second order levers, third order levers. We usually touch on this in our personal training or strength and conditioning. I'm not going to focus on it too much. I've just got the 3 order levers just to run through. So we can start to think about force, moment arm, and then modifying or understanding when we look at our clients deadlifting, actually maybe that moment arm is too big. Why is that? Is there a limitation in hip mobility? Is the weight too far away? Or do they just need coaching into the right position? So what you can see here is a first order. I'm going to give you a technique, by the way, for remembering each of these in one of the subsequent slides. So these images come from, here's a recommendation in books if you like them, or your birthday coming up. Starting Strength by Mark Ripto, some great images and descriptions of biomechanical application of squat, bench, deadlift, some of the Olympic lifts. He's more powerlifting, I think. And he gives nice imagery to this example of a seesaw in a first order lever, where the fulcrum or the pivot is in the middle, the force or the weight is at one end, and then, sorry, I do apologize. The force is at one end and the weight or the resistance is at the other end. That's a first order lever. It's one of the most efficient and effective classifications of levers because you can have that longer lever that pushes a heavy weight much easier, but it's kind of that balance there. With a second order lever, this is now everything is in different orders, which is where you can see the fulcrum is at one end. In this example, we're looking at a bicep curl. Got the fulcrum at one end, the weight in the middle, and then the force being produced at the end there. So again, it's a different order for each of the components to be able to move weight away from where you've got gravity down below. So you're going to be opposing gravity in a free weight or lifting your arm in simple terms. If it helps, you can imagine having a dumbbell in the hand And that gives you the example of a second order lever. With it, a third order lever, it's probably the most challenging of the three. The fulcrum's at one end, the weight's at the opposite end, and the force is in the middle. Now what you've got is an image here of a lat raise, which shows you the force arm, the weight arm. The weight is much longer than the force arm, so it's going to be more challenging. And actually we could probably consider the deadlift as a third order lever in relation to certainly the knees and the use of the force coming from the quads, but also potentially if you're looking at the weight, the body weight coming over, the force coming up, lifting the weight from the floor and the fulcrum of the hip. So with all that in mind, you can imagine those moment arms could change depending on where that bar is, where your client's body position is. Their lever lengths are either going to make the moment arm bigger or shorter. A shorter moment arm is going to be easier, longer it's going to be harder, as we saw in that first video. So this is a really simple way to remember the classifications of the levers. First order lever, first class lever, that's the same thing. So if you remember the term FLE, F-L-E, it helps you remember whatever part of the order is in the middle. So in a first class lever, the F or the fulcrum is in the middle. Second class, it's the load is in the middle. And the third class, the effort is in the middle. Most classifications of levers in the body are in a third order lever. We're not going to get too much into that detail. I don't want to get people, we don't want to get too complex. But understanding a little bit about these classifications when you're asking clients to lift things, it can help if we understand a bit about the pivot, the load, the weight, and how we can maybe alter that, coach them, or maybe they need to improve certain movement around certain parts of their body that are pivots or fulcrums to achieve a better moment arm. This is another great image from the book. And it gives a really simple visual representation of the moment arm. So from the left to the right, you can see how it's getting easier. Left-hand image is perfectly balanced, so that the weight is directly over that midline. As the weight moves away, you can see there's a short moment arm. So, okay, he's taking a bit of the load now. The next one, the moment arm gets bigger, it becomes hard, and you can see the guy on the right-hand side sweating away. That moment arm is much bigger. So if you visualize that in a deadlift, where would the bar be best positioned for an efficient and effective deadlift from the floor? So if your client was going to step towards the bar, would they want to step close to it, further away from it, somewhere in the middle? What do you think? Looking at that and just that little example, closest to the body, right? Anything different? You see how that makes sense. So what might limit our clients from getting the bar close to the shins, being able to bend over and pick them up? Anything you can think of that might limit that? Anatomically, environmentally, grip-wise, anything at all that you can think of. What about the knees? So be specific. Why would the knees limit? Lack of flexion of what? So being really clear and specific about your example will help. So knees what? Lack of flexion in what? So let's give me a little bit more detail, guys. What else could limit? In the back, could be in the knees as well. So a lack of flexion in the back and a lack of flexion in the knees, do you mean? Lars says traveling towards the toes, obstructing a straight path. Oh, the knees, right. So if the knees traveling towards the toes, obstructing a straight path, I'm not sure quite what that means. So lack of range, lack of, how are they, you mean obstructing on the way back up? Is that what you mean, Lyle? So certain body parts is some of the examples people are giving here. Any other ideas? So far we've got knees and back. Anything else that's involved in a deadlift that could limit having that bar nice and close when you perform or you're wanting to teach your client, coach your client to deadlift from the floor? Stiff hips, yeah. So if the hips are stiff and they are limited in how much flexion they can go into, potentially too tight in the calf. Yeah, right. I think that might tie into what Lyle was saying. The ankle range of motion. So as if that's your toes that way, that's your heel, and there's your tibia. As you come down, then you need the knees to come forwards, which is what Lyle's talking about. So you need a certain amount of range through the back of the heel. So what could limit dorsiflexion, which is what's happening as the tibia moves forwards? It's the same as the toes coming up, but actually the tibia is moving forwards in a deadlift. So what could limit that ankle dorsiflexion, do you think? Biomechanically, what could limit dorsiflexion? Any thoughts, any of you? Come on, you biomechanics coaches, you should be typing away on this one. And do you know how to test for those types of things? So things like calves, which is what Matt has given as an example. So calf flexibility. The other two subsystems in there would be the joint. So if the joint is stiff, the subtalar joint is very stiff, or the mid-tarsal joint even. And then the nervous system. So remember we talked about the three subsystems earlier. So if any of those are limiting what's going on at the ankle, that alone could limit your client's deadlift. So this is where breaking a deadlift down, which sounds a very simple exercise, actually any limitation, that's just one joint. The knees may lack range, mobility, etc. And then the hips, the same as Hamish was suggesting, the hips might be stiff at the joint, might be stiff in the muscles, or they may be stiff in the nervous system. So there's a lot of things to consider, isn't there? And we haven't gone to the spine yet, but we're going to go there. We're going to go there shortly. So we can now appreciate maybe how we want to consider all the tools in our repertoire for helping clients to perform a good deadlift. So understanding force on the spine. So we're just going to move up a little bit here. This is, again, a really great image to kind of give us understanding of the point of when you think about why would we do a deadlift? What are we achieving? If I give you the word strength-wise in a deadlift. So we had mentioned earlier about strength for legs or strength for the Olympic lifts, which are very, very dynamic and explosive. Tibialis anterior tightness, restricting foot movement could be an issue as well, question mark. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick question on what are we strengthening in a deadlift? What's the big kind of, why would anybody want to deadlift? Obviously to pick a child up off the floor, but what does it do to the body in particular? Why deadlift? I want to pick the children off the floor. Well, how does it help you do that? How does it influence the body? In particular, specifically. Glute strength. Great, thanks, Hamish. So Hamish, you've been very specific. Glute strength. Yeah, so we think about it as a glute exercise. Any other strengthening in a deadlift? In the deadlift that we've given as an example, just the glutes. A big hint would be the slide I've just pulled up as well, because it's actually considered more hamstrings. Yeah, absolutely. They work obviously with the glutes to extend the hip, but it's actually considered one of the best back strengthening exercises there is. that obviously comes with a challenge when there's a high population in the UK with bad backs. So we want to strengthen it, but we're nervous, like Matt admitted earlier, he's nervous about getting clients to deadlift because they may have a stiff or sore back or limitations, and he's worried about harming them, which is exactly where we need to be. So if we think of the deadlift as a back strengthening exercise, and we've talked about a lot of posterior muscles is where I think I was trying to take the conversation. It's thought of as a posterior strength training move. However, what you can see to truly stabilize the spine, and McGill talks about this, Grakovetsky, Mark Ripto showing it here with his images, true strength of the spine has to be from the entire unit. So while a lot of the load will be on the back, we certainly need opposing strength from the anterior side of the trunk to truly stabilize the spine. And you can see he's given examples in here: posterior stabilizing force generated by isometric contraction of the spinal erectors. Well, we know that, we get that. But he's also showing how we need force in the anterior stabilizers to be able to close that unit, that cylinder, to be able to produce a stiff and stable trunk area that's going to have that load coming up into it when we use the legs to push through those joint actions in the hip and the knee. Down, lower down, anterior stabilizing force form increases intra-abdominal pressure, which we know if you lift something heavy off the floor, you kind of, and then we create that pressure, which actually comes more potentially from the inside. So trying to understand these forces is an important aspect of our coaching and our training. And we're going to talk more about what that might look like prior to a deadlift to create that kind of intra-abdominal pressure, anterior, posterior strength, and obviously through the sides. So we get that nice stiff trunk so that then we can truly strengthen our glutes and hamstrings for both strength, power, speed, and picking up little children when the need is there. So let's just bring about another important consideration. So looking at these three images, I want you to just glance at the lengths of femurs and tibias in particular. So what you can see here in terms of genetics. So up to now we've talked about function and subsystems that we can potentially improve with movement. Techniques like mobility, nerve mobilization, muscle energy techniques. What we're looking at here now are limitations that we cannot change. So if you've ever watched the Olympics and those, usually the Chinese guys are very short in stature and they have very short femurs, which can be an advantage because it creates a short moment arm. So if you look at the image at the very bottom there. So if your client represents with a short femur, they're probably going to be easier in terms of coaching than lifting a bar off the floor, simply because they have a genetic advantage. The guy in the middle over on the right-hand side, who's, I think he's figure 3, he's got those super long femurs. Yeah, if you've got long femurs, you probably know about it. Fiona, that's probably me and you. Long fingers? No, femurs. You've got long fingers as well. But those long femurs then in deadlift squats, they're creating a much longer moment arm. So can you see how the position of the back has to compensate for that? For the point that Lal raised earlier about the knees tipping over the bar and struggling to lift that bar beyond the knees because of those great long femurs, you would almost need more range through the hips or the back, or a stronger back. So you can see how genetics could be a limiter. The top figure is probably the norms. I don't like using norms when it comes to anatomy, but maybe kind of in the middle of those ranges. Does that make sense how genetics plays into that moment arm? So you can move the bar, of course. We can improve hip mobility, we can improve dorsiflexion at the ankle, we can improve the knees, everything else, but actually there are some things that we just cannot change. So let's analyze the movement And let's talk about joint actions. So what joint actions are involved in a deadlift? Just very simple, just bullet fire your answers into the chat box. Just simple terms. What are the joint actions? What are the joints involved? Run through those joint actions. We've talked about quite a few of them. Which joints are involved? 3 key joints that we've talked about. See if anybody can beat me to type it. Ankle, knees, hips. Great, thanks, Hamish. So they're the key joints, if we simplify this. Yep, perfect, thanks, Matthew. So the ankles, the knees, and the hips. What joint actions are occurring at each of those joints? So what happens at the hip during a deadlift? Hip first, what happens? What is the primary action or actions occurring? Extension? Anything else happening in the hip? Hinges, we could call it a hinge, yeah. But there's actions within a hinge. We've got one of them, extension. What would be the other one? Flexion, perfect. So the hip does flexion and extension. So therefore the knees are going to flex and extend, and the ankle will flex, dorsiflex, plantar flex. Yeah, so flexion. I don't know why they don't call it plantar extension, but there you go. Whoever that Latin guy was who called it all that stuff. Good. So prime movers are going to be which muscle groups in the hips? So without naming any muscles, what are the primary group of muscles? Biomechanics coaches, you know this. What are the primary movers in the hips during a deadlift? Without naming glute max, you know, to group them. So more than the glutes. So it is the glutes, Hamish, but the 3 glutes do quite different things. So what's the action that the group of muscles, so we've got the prime movers are the extensors, which means the antagonists are the hip flexors. So if when we're going into hip flexion, the extensors are the prime movers, it's because they are eccentric, concentric. So they are always the prime movers, but it's doing eccentric, concentric action. Or if you start at the floor, it's concentric, and then as you lower it down, it's eccentric. So even though you're doing the action of hip flexion on the way down, it is because the extensors are prime movers through an eccentric contraction. We can look at the same at the knees. Primarily, it's the knee extensors that are lowering you, and then they are lifting you, so they're prime movers there. And then the same with the plantar flexors at the ankle. So just so that we've got all that in mind. But I want to make sure that we keep a focus on what we can do. So I'm going to keep going through. Let me bring it back in here. Good. So we're all in the same place. So these are going to be key areas to consider. The spine extensors aren't going to work alone. They may be primary loaded because we want the spine to stay still during a lift. We don't want too much flexion. We're going to talk about that in a moment and challenge it. But we do need flexor strength as well. Spine flexors do need to co-contract to enable our client to truly stabilize the spine while the hip extends, the knee extends, the ankle plantar flexes. And we want that thoracolumbar fascia, which is the TLF on here, to really engage so that the facet joints are protected. So all that makes sense so far. So what does the deadlift offer? Well, we know it's a leg, back, and a function exercise in terms of picking up children and for the lifts, but primarily it's part of a kinetic chain. So if I got you all to stand up for me, please. You're not going to do anything else other than stand up. So if you all stand up, and I can see you all. Come on, Matt, stand up. You can sit down again. Everybody sit back down. and then let me know the first thing that happened when I said to you to stand up. What was the first thing you did? Come on, I'm hoping to get some good answers in here from you guys. Those who know our ethos. So what's the first thing that you did when I asked you to stand? Put my foot down, okay? That was like an angry mother putting your foot down. No, okay, putting the foot down, or putting your food down. I thought you said foot. Put my food down, okay. I'll let you have that one. Anything else? Checked my surroundings. Very safe, Lyle, well done. Anything different? Stiff upper body, brace the core, all that stuff, yeah? Okay, well, all of that happened after a whole load of stuff went on that you didn't think about or you weren't conscious of. So you heard the cue, stand up. Some of you were like, does she mean it? So you're processing, the brain's processing it. Do I stand up? Then I encouraged you a little bit and I paused, so you knew I was asking you to stand up. The brain is taking that message and then it's feeding it down the spinal cord, through the peripheral nerves, to the muscles, about how much muscle tone to apply so that when you stand up, your spine doesn't move in any adverse direction. So a whole bunch of stuff happened around your spine. The multifidus, the rotatorius, the deep transversospinalis group should have applied enough tone around your spine joints so that when you stood up, you didn't flop over to the side, because the moment arm increased and the weight of your body got pulled to the floor. The conscious bit is when you put your food down, or you push your foot down, or you go to extend the hips, stiffen the body. That's the conscious part. The other stuff happens, and it's really important. It's the same in a deadlift. You think about position, brace, and then lift. But if any part of that kinetic chain isn't functioning well, it may be that what we're doing is we're stiffening the body upon dysfunction. So we need to be aware of how we can assess our clients. So being conscious of the anatomy, the way the body functions, all of that making sense, we need to understand the facet joints of proximity, make sure QL is moving freely. So testing QL for hinges, giving them wall glides to get that spine moving, can take tension off the discs, the nervous system, so that they're good for lift. So we can show you those on other workshops, but obviously I know you guys will know a whole bunch of stuff around that anyway. But if we think of this image here from Grakowetsky's work, the red bit is the thoracolumbar fascia, the two bands coming off with your TVA. This is a front view. This is missing the rectus femoris, rectus abdominis. So can you see how the spine will go into extension through the engagement of TVA if we don't have anterior bracing at the same time? So it's really important that we understand how to create strength around the whole body so that they can lift that weight off the floor. Multifidus over on that left-hand image, TVA on the left, multifidus on the right. We need to make sure they're all working optimally. There's also differences in anatomy. So your hip joint design, a bit like those femur lengths, can interfere with the quality of your deadlift or your client's deadlift, different angles. So this is what we're going to look at here as we go into assessing. So I'm going to show you a couple of really easy, simple, quick fire tests just to check if your client has any limitation in the hip. So you can have them lying supine on the floor or on a bed. I'm going to look at whether their hip design could be limiting something. So what we've got is known as, we're going to look at, first of all, the femoral version. So if the client is lying on the back, flex the hip, and you want the knee perpendicular to the hip. So obviously ask permission before you touch clients, and then we're going to keep the knee above that hip without moving, and you're just going to rotate the leg laterally, medially, and then laterally. And you're gauging the range of motion for internal rotation at the hip, which is when the foot comes out, the femur's rotating in, or when the femur's rotating laterally, the foot comes in, to understand, are they within the norms, or could there be a limitation? I'm just going to bring the slide back up so I can show you that a bit more easily on here. So the one I just showed you is the left-hand image. So lying on the back, positioning the knee directly above the hip, and then the leg should be parallel to the floor. And then you literally just rotate the hip by moving the foot, keeping the knee super still directly above that hip. So if they've got increased internal rotation, they could have a femoral anteversion, and that's where their hip design is more forward. So they're more internally rotated naturally. Yeah. If there's an increased external rotation, they could have a hip design where the acetabulum is more pointing out to the side rather than forwards. And there are norms of these or extremes. So anything much greater than 40 to 45 degrees, we might consider is their joint design. The image in the middle, you can see how this can be done with the client lying prone on their front, and you would simply flex the knee and rotate it in and out. In exactly the same way, you're looking at their how easily or how difficult it is to do that. So that can be a good indicator. So if someone has a femoral anteversion, which means that the acetabulum are more forward pointing, they may be more internally rotated structurally, how could that impact on their deadlift? What might we need to consider when we're coaching them to deadlift? What might impact, how might that impact on their body? If they're, see if I can show you. So I've got the right leg, yeah, okay, do that. So if there's a normal position, but if they're naturally more medially rotated here, how might that impact? Need a slightly wider stance to be comfortable if they're more medially rotated? What might be a more comfortable stance position if their structure is more internally rotated? Yeah, narrow, yeah, exactly, good. So yeah, they would need potentially, so if we're coaching techniques, some gurus will teach you 2 o'clock or 10 to 2 or whatever it is with the toe position. I think Kelly Starrett talks about toe position, although he does acknowledge we need different ideas. So somebody who is femorally anteverted may need a narrower stance. And then to Fiona's point, if they're more retroverted, they may need a wider stance. So it's important that we coach them to go to a comfortable position for them, trying not to force positions. We can practice different positions. I'm anteverted. I cannot sumo squat. It's the weirdest sensation for me. It's just physically virtually impossible. So I generally have a relatively narrow stance for both deadlifts and squats. I actually find that far more comfortable. Doesn't mean we can't go to different foot positions, but we don't want to be forcing somebody who's anteverted into a sumo. They may start to get really uncomfortable. So I hope that makes sense. So another test that we could do on the hip, and this is a similar idea, but different. So this is now looking at coxa valga and vera. And this is a deviation. Instead of the rotation aspect, it's in the angle between the neck of the femur and the shaft of the femur. So the left-hand image, that 130 degrees, is a kind of normal range between 120 and 135. Coxa vera is where the angle is much smaller. That's going to mean that the knee is going to be coming maybe slightly inwards. Coxa valga is in the opposite direction, where the angle is much bigger. So you can imagine again how this might impact on your client. And again, we can test this very loosely. Again, the client lying supine. And again, you must ask permission. Make sure you've got insurance scope for these with your clients, depending on your skill set. So with this one, what we'd want to do is hold the opposite ASIS down, keep the leg straight, and then we're going to abduct the leg. And again, what we're looking at is to make sure that the hip doesn't drop down on the opposite side once we take the leg to optimum, to identify retroverted on one side, my squat and deadlift look ridiculous, but the wider stance suits me. Right, okay. So there we've got one of you sort of sharing recognition that Fiona has that difference in anatomy. So if they have a greater angle, so if you're taking the leg out, and again, if you go beyond 45 degrees of abduction with the hip staying still, it could be they have a coxa valga. If it doesn't go very far at all, it could be they're a coxa vera. And similar to what we talked about earlier, that could impact on how wide or narrow we encourage them to place their feet. So these are important things to acknowledge. You can't change structure, but we can modify the way we coach the deadlift based on simple tests that we can look at and learn to work out, are they within the norms, or is there, oh, actually they've got a lot of abduction, so maybe they have that coxa valga presentation. But please don't tell your client you have coxa valga. We don't want to be prescriptive unless you have that skill set and you have that qualification. But some simple tests, looking at the way they move, or even when you're watching them deadlift, if they're always saying, oh, Matt, I hate those sumos, can we not do those? You may think, oh, okay, maybe, because you heard that sumos were really good, but actually with this client, maybe it's their hip design. So let's understand risk. Now, another resource I suggest you go and have a look at is this guy. So Tim Gabbett is the other side of the world, Australia. And he came over here some time we weren't locked down. It was before lockdown, actually. In fact, it was the February before lockdown, to teach a workshop on load management and tissue tolerance. And for me, it was one of those game changers. He's done the research, he's got evidence, and actually what he's proving, along with our work, is there are a number of both intrinsic and extrinsic issues that we need to consider when we're loading our clients. And we've talked about most of these, or examples of most of these. The intrinsics are the muscles, the bones, and the nervous system. And in a deadlift, we've talked about, in simple terms, the ankle, the knee, and the hip, keeping the spine nice and still. Extrinsic might be the positioning of the load, using a heel lift, using a belt, other aspects, the change in the load, the heavier load, the lighter load, the point where they pick it up to create the moment arm. And it's a combination of understanding all of these impacts on our clients' load that we need to be mindful of. And I think fundamentally what every single one of us, you and I, are doing with clients is improving their tissue tolerance and managing the loads. Whether you're a manual therapist, a strength coach, a personal trainer, or a biomechanics coach, that's what we're involved in. And when I say tissue tolerance, I don't just mean deadlifting. I mean, like Matt was talking about earlier, preparing for the deadlift. So getting the inner tissues stronger, mobile, more functioning optimally, the nervous system, the joints, while understanding genetic limitations. So there's a guy called Grakovetsky. I don't know if you can see that. Let me just move you across a bit and move you that way. See if I can move you just out the way when I put it back on. The proposed mechanisms of the thick fascia within the body, which is a big aspect. The thoracolumbar fascia is a big piece of deadlifting. And Grakovetsky's wrote a fantastic book, The Spinal Engine, which is extremely expensive in the scheme of things. However, you can read about his theory in that book and his description of the hydraulic amplification effect on that thoracolumbar fascia around the back in terms of creating this cylinder that allows for greater muscle contraction. Now, what's interesting about Grakovetsky's theory is he talks about the mathematical formulas that show this thoracolumbar fascia improves the back strength by over 30% from going into extension from flexion. So he advocates some degree of flexion when bending over in a deadlift, so that you're actually initiating extension. This kind of goes against maybe what some of us think about in terms of getting a client to deadlift off the floor. We wouldn't want them going into flexion to deadlift off the floor into extension. That's not what he's referring to. But if we get their body moving really well, optimally, and then strengthen them appropriately prior to deadlifting, particularly if they want to be a power lifter, you will see in powerlifters, they will flex before they extend out of that deadlift. And people say, oh, that's really bad. Well, it's not if they develop the tissue, manage the load over time. People like Mark Ripto, many years ago, when I was uneducated and I was dissing his technique myself, and I now eat my words, because he was flexing in the spine. But he developed that thoracolumbar fascia to allow for the hydraulic amplification effect of flexion to extension to really develop this extra 30%. And just a small slide again on Cholowicki's work into holding the breath and creating that intra-abdominal pressure, something we may be nervous about from our training. In a powerlifter, they absolutely need it. So understanding your client and what we're trying to achieve, but understanding holding the breath can actually decompress lumbar 4 and 5 by up to 40% when improving that technical stability. But it is all about the preparation in advance of that. So I hope you understand what I mean. We're not just going to get clients to start holding the breath and flexing before they deadlift. Matt pointed it out earlier very nicely in terms of preparing clients first. So understanding your client's body intrinsically, the lifts we're going to ask them to perform extrinsically, so that we can take them through a nice periodized model of preparing, giving them strength and control, which may be bracing practice on the floor, just body weight, using the limbs, dead bugs to get that anterior strength, to develop a good strength ratio around the trunk, so that when we start going towards the deadlift, they're ready and they're prepared. We've got to keep in mind, as always, this entire system within our clients' bodies. It isn't just a hip and a knee exercise, or it isn't just a back exercise. It is a whole body movement. We might talk about shoes on another session, but I hope that brings to light some more considerations when we analyze movement in more detail to help you equip yourselves with maybe a bit of direction onto other training courses or other workshops that could fill in more of the gaps. If you feel like there's some areas here we've covered that you want to develop further, the biomechanics. So we've talked about Mark Ripto's book, Starting Strength. We've talked about Tim Gabbett's research. He's on Instagram, by the way. I think he does his tissue tolerance and load management online. I think I've seen him do that, probably as a result of lockdown. Definitely go and check him out. He's done the research. He's helping female athletes, I think, rugby players, wasn't it, on that research, and looking at statistics on tissue tolerance and load management. But what he adds into it isn't just strength. He talks about sleep, diet, mindset, recovery, volume of training, type of training, stress, the menstrual cycle in female players is all load on the body. So if you have a lifter who's female, or a lifter who's new, or a lifter who's got stress or doesn't sleep or poor diet, all of these can impact on their body's ability to develop the tissue tolerance, because the loads are vast. It isn't just reps and sets. We've got to add in lifestyle as well. So with 1 minute to go, I'm going to bring this webinar into a close. If there's any last minute questions, feel free to type them in. I hope it was useful. Anybody watching this on a recording, as I said earlier, info@biomechanics.education.com. Next week, we're going to be talking about foot biomechanics made simple. So you might find that a useful one just to bolt in to this one when we talk about feet. We can talk about deadlifts then as well, if you like. The week after that, we're going to talk about pain science made simple. And again, just an hour, these nice little bite size. I think people can access them quite easily. If there's any other topics even you would like us to talk about, do email me, rachel@biomechanics.education.com, tag me, share, please take photos, share this stuff on social media, on your platforms, tag Biomechanics Education, so we can help you grow your audience and help more people move more freely.